Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's had a pretty good week so far, and I hope everyone's doing well. Um, we're still in the book of Isaiah. We're going to finish up on Isaiah today, and then, of course, next quarter, I think Brother Tony said we was going to be in Luke. So let's go on into Isaiah. But first, I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of some of the themes that we've kind of covered. We covered God is the Holy One of Israel, and Israel is his holy people who worship in Jerusalem, God's holy city. And God is incomparable. No one is like him. And we've seen that. He's the servant of the Lord, will bring salvation to Israel and the nations, and he will establish justice, righteousness, and peace. So we've covered that. Now we're going to see the dismiss of the wicked, but hope and deliverance for the faithful. Isaiah's message warns people of God's judgment and exhorts them to trust in his salvation. We've seen all along that God has a plan. He's had a plan since the beginning of time. So we know what God has planned out for us. It's been revealed to us, and we know what's going to happen. We just don't know when. So let's get into the last chapter in this lesson for this quarter. And it's called God Restores. And if you have a quarterly, it's session 13, page 118. We're going to cover Isaiah 65, verses 17 through 25. And it says, the one true God promises to restore his creation for his people through faith in his Son. Now pay close attention to that. The one true God promises. When God promises something, he does not go back on his promise. He will never, ever break his promise to his people. So let's go again and see what Isaiah says here. You know, sometimes life's challenges can cause us to lose hope. Would it be from losing a job, having a sickness, something that kind of cripples us? We can see that life's challenges do pose a problem to us. But we shouldn't lose hope. God has given us hope in his promise to us. But if we're not careful, we can begin to believe all is lost. But that's not the case. The Bible teaches that the future should impact how believers live in the present. Isaiah revealed to us glimpses of what God would do for us in the future so that we might be encouraged to be faithful as we wait on him. Hope in the future gives strength in the present. So we need to hope and pray for the future because it's going to give us strength to carry on right now. A lot of people will just throw up their hands and say, that's it, I'm tired of waiting, but we don't need to be like that. We've got hope in the future. We have a promise that will be fulfilled. In Isaiah 61, let's just recap some of the chapters here. In Isaiah 61, the prophet told of the appearing of the Messiah in his first coming. He came to save his people. And here Isaiah described how the Messiah would come a second time to vindicate his people. They would be ministers to God as they rejoiced in his salvation and righteousness. In Isaiah 62, he focuses attention on Jerusalem. Even though sin had separated God and his people in Jerusalem, there would come a time when God would fully restore their relationship and the Lord would delight in Jerusalem. Isaiah 63 through 64 turns attention to God's judgment on the nations and the vindication of his people. In chapter 65 through 66, the Lord answers their prayers, promising to judge idolaters and deliver and bless the righteous. So these are things that we see from Isaiah 61 to 65 that God has taken care of and has promised. Now let's go into Isaiah 65 verse 17 through 20. And let's do 17 first and then we'll come and do the rest of them. And it says, for I will create a new heaven and a new earth. The past events will not be remembered or come to mind. You know, that kind of expounds a promise that God made in verses 13 and 16 concerning his servant. And we all know who his servant is. It's Jesus Christ. And the word "for" is the key word that makes this link. Verses 13 and 16 contrast what will happen to those who reject the Lord with the blessings God had in store for his servant. Now, verse 17 answers these questions. How will God turn things around from the present disaster and the humiliation of his people? How will he do what appears to be impossible? God says, look at me. I am able to do these things. Often we have difficulty believing that God's promises simply mean that they have a perspective of him or not looking at all at him. We're like that sometimes. But we need to look at him and see him for who he really is. And then there will be no question about how God will do whatever he promises. We have to look. And looking, we see. Now, what did God promise? First, he promised to create a new heaven and a new earth. He promised that. The new era that God will create for his creation in Christ will commence with the creation of a new heaven and a new earth. God will not merely patch things up. He won't do that. He will create everything new in the heavens and the earth. It will be comprehensive, and it fits with Isaiah's promise of a future newness. God's promised that a new heaven and a new earth will come. You know, he spoke of new events in chapter 42, verse 9, and 48, verse 6. He spoke of a new song in chapter 42, verse 10. Something new was 43, verse 19. New things is 48, verse 6. And a new name is 62, verse 2. You know, these messages correspond to the message of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, who prophesied of a future when God would give a new covenant and his people would have a new heart and a new spirit. Can you imagine that? This has already been prophesied. This is going to happen. We can bet on that. God's new creation will usher in a holy forgetfulness where human failure and sin, along with its consequences, will be remembered no more. God's going to forget all the past. We're starting out new. We got a new heaven, new earth. We're going to be new people. So all the old is forgotten and forgiven. It's gone. It's in the past. So we don't have to worry about that no more. Let's look at verses 18 through 20. Then be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating. For I will create Jerusalem to be a joy and its people to be a delight. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. The sound of weeping and crying will no longer be heard in her. In her, a nursing infant will no longer live only a few days, or no man live out his days. Indeed, the one who dies at 100-year-old will be mourned as a young man, and the one who misses 100 years will be considered cursed. You know, the only response I can do to that is the amazing news is gladness and rejoicing. That's what it's going to be. We're going to be happy. We're going to be singing. We're going to be rejoicing. And that's what God said for us to do. Be glad and rejoice forever. And what he's creating. He's creating a new heaven and a new earth. You know, as the people of God, we need to cast away the disappointments and discouragement and look to what God is doing for us. God's telling us that the old Jerusalem will be replaced with a new one. And that will bring joy to God and to people who live in Jerusalem and to others. Jerusalem, along with its inhabitants, will be in a place of holiness, harmony, and happiness. As God delights in them, they will be a delight to others as they reflect God's character. And we should be reflecting God's character now so he can be a delight, so we can be a delight to him. You know, before this future time of restoration, there will be a time of tearing down, which simply means the Lord will be the one who tears it down. If you notice, when we was in Isaiah 29, God said he would oppress Jerusalem, and there would be mourning and crying. He would encircle it, lay siege to it, and bring it down, as he would lead many nations against it. Over 100 years after Isaiah's prophecy, these words came true, as God directed the Babylonians, along with many other nations under their control, to execute God's judgment on Jerusalem and its people. See, God can direct anybody to do his will. God is all-powerful. And we can see that God tore down the temple and its people right here in Isaiah 29. But a remnant returned to Jerusalem from exile. They came home to a city in ruin and mourned over the reproach that the city had become. And slowly they started building it back. But however, with all this, in the new era God has in store for his people, not only will the city be rebuilt and restored and the past be forgotten, but God's righteous anger against Jerusalem and its inhabitants will be replaced with the Lord's rejoicing and gladness in them. Complete turnaround. Israel had sinned, therefore they paid the penalty for their sin. God sent the Babylonians to destroy everything. But a remnant got to go back. And they slowly started to rebuild the temple and its areas. So we can see God's anger turned back. And that he is replaced with rejoicing and gladness. You know, this message also echoed David's words concerning the Lord and his people. And it says, and I quote, "For his anger lasts only a moment, but his favor a lifetime. Weeping may stay overnight, but there is joy in the morning." And that's from Psalms 30, verse 5. Their rejoicing will replace their weeping. And God's delight in Jerusalem and its people will replace this favor. God will eradicate every source of sorrow for his people. Okay, we have a loving God. He may get angry, just as David said in Psalms 35. It's just for a moment. And then he turns back to us as we ask for forgiveness. When God created the heavens and the earth, he looked at his creation and saw that it was good. But it was only after he created man and woman that he said it was very good. So no doubt when God creates a new heaven and a new earth, it will be good. But the object of his greatest delight will be his holy people who reside there with him. We are God's holy delight. He loves us, he wants to take care of us, and he does provide for us every day. But when we sin, God has to punish us. But his favor returns to us when we ask for forgiveness. What an awesome God we have. Let's go to verse 20. Now, it provides an example of how things will be different for the people of God in the new era. Premature death was common in that time, during the time of Isaiah. And adults alike. I mean, people could die young. They didn't also always live to be a certain age. So we can see this was a fact of life in Isaiah's time. But however, the children who are born on this new earth will not die in infancy. And the adults will live to a ripe old age. The Israelites appear to have underscored 70 years to be a normal lifespan. But in the new era, a man would live only 100 years would be thought of as having died young. So can you imagine being 100 years old and passing away and they thought you was young? We look at 100 years old today like a miracle that somebody made it that far. But in this new era of time, it's going to be different. You may live longer than 100 years. You may live 200 or 300 years. If you died 100 years, they're going to say you were young. But if you died before 100 years, you were cursed. You had sin somewhere along the line. So God was kind of making a point that people will live longer lives during this time. Having children and living a long, healthy life were both understood to be signs of God's blessing in ancient Israel, and as God's rewards to those who served him in faithful obedience. Wasn't that wonderful that God thought that he could make things like that happen? Let's go to verse 21 now through 23. People will build houses and live in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They will not build and others live in them. They will not plant and others eat. For my people's lives will be like the lifetime of a tree. My chosen ones will fully enjoy the work of their hands. They will not labor without success or bear children destined for disaster. For they will be a people blessed by the Lord along with their descendants. You know, when Israel was destroyed, the city of Jerusalem, people had built houses and were living in them. Had built vineyards and were working them. But when they were exiled, other people came in and started living in these houses. So this is what the Lord is saying. You know, that you build houses and you lived in them, and you plant vineyards and you eat the fruit. But that other people had come in and took over. And they were not built for others to live in them. They did not plant them grapes for others to live in. That wasn't what God had in mind. But that's what happened. You know, in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 15 through 68 is a list of curses where Moses described what would happen when the Israelites broke God's covenant by disobeying his law. Now, some of these curses were agricultural disasters, foreign invasions, deportation into exile, and the reproach of foreign nations, and a big famine. And we can see that happened every time that Israel was invaded. They lost their crops. Foreign countries took over. They were exiled. And people laughed at them. People didn't want to be around them. Deuteronomy 28, verses 30b particularly states that because of their unfaithfulness to the Lord, the Israelites would build houses but not live in them. And that's just what he said right there in verse 20. They'd build houses and not live in them. And they'd plant vineyards but not eat the fruit that they produced. Because this implied that others would come and take these things away from the people, which they did. And in Isaiah 65, verse 21 through 22a, the Lord stated just the opposite. He repeated this idea in both verses in order to emphasize the stark contrast between what the people had experienced with what they would experience in the future era. The people of God would enjoy living in the homes they built and eating the fruit from the vineyards they planted. God's promised this. He didn't want your homes to be overtaken. He didn't want their vineyards to be eaten by somebody else. But it happened. But now he's stating when he builds the new heaven and the new earth, that's not going to happen. When a house is built, they're going to live in it. When they plant a vineyard, they're going to eat from it. That's what God's promise is. In the last part of verse 22, the Lord spoke of more blessings and longevity of life, productivity, and the satisfaction of enjoying the fruits of their labor. You know, the Lord used a simple tree to represent the vitality and durability of his people. The expression, my chosen ones, serves as a reminder that all these blessings are expressions of God's incomprehensible grace toward his people. You know, we can't imagine how big God's grace is toward us. It's just unimaginable that he can have that much grace for us. It's unimaginable that he can love us that much. But to love us enough to send his son, Jesus Christ, here to die on the cross, so his blood can give us salvation, or to tell us just how big and great God's love is for us. And all he desires from us is our faithfulness and the obeying of his laws. That's all. It's not hard to do for most of us. Well, I take that back. I found it hard to do too, so I can't say for most of us. I'm in the same category that everybody else is. I fight with it every day. But God loves us, and he knows that as being frail humans that we're going to fail. But we also know, because he is God and a loving God, we can ask for forgiveness through his son. And the Israelites at that time, they had a vision of what the future was going to be. God was telling Isaiah, this is what's going to happen. Let's go on to verses 24 through 25. Even before they call, I will answer. While they are still speaking, I will hear. The wolf and the lamb will feed together, and the lion will eat straw like cattle. But the serpent's food will be dust. They will not do what is evil or destroy on my entire holy mountain, says the Lord. Now the Lord's emphasized that new heaven and earth would be characterized by peace between the created and the creator. There's going to be peace. He's promising that. And we've read that. It's in the Bible where it plainly states the wolf and the lamb will feed together. The lion will eat straw. There will be no danger from anything. And the serpent's food will be dust. Now let's look at this word he says, before they call. Before they call, I will answer. Now and peace between creatures, the wolf and the lamb. God will be attentive to the needs of his people. And when they had strayed away from God in rebellion against him, he had ignored their cries. But that would be no more in the new heaven and the new earth. It would be no more. The people, thus it indicates the sins that separated people from God's will. There will be no more. What is more, the harmony the people of God will enjoy with God will extend to all creation. And you believe that, all creation is going to feel it. And evil will be unable to destroy what God will establish on his holy mountain. God gave his word on that. And that's pretty amazing to me. What joy, gladness, no more weeping, no more sorrows. When God creates the new heaven and the new earth. The houses we build, we'll live in. The vineyards we create and grow, we'll eat from. That's God's promise to us. We can live in hope, knowing that God will one day create a new heaven and a new earth. We can live with confidence, knowing that we will experience God's blessing for eternity. And we can live with expectancy, knowing that God's peace will reign in eternity. We won't have to fear the serpent anymore. He's going to be eating dust. There'll be no worries from him. God is going to take care of everything. What a day of rejoicing there will be when the new heaven and new earth come into being. That ends pretty much the book of Isaiah. I hope you've been able to pick up some of the things that Isaiah is saying here. I know I run through it pretty quickly sometimes. I get to talking faster than my mind can work sometimes, but bear with me, and we'll get better as time goes on. And we'll this coming quarter, we'll dive into Luke and see what Paul's up to. I hope you all have a blessed week. God bless you all, and hopefully we'll be together soon. Have a good day.